Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
If you want to grow the reach, revenue, and impact of your learning business, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
When your marketing doesn't convert the way you expect, it can be frustrating and maybe a little confusing. You've put in the time to craft messages that are clear, compelling, and persuasive, and still, prospective learners don't act. Part of the reason is that people don't make decisions the way we think they do. Much of the time, they're operating on autopilot, relying on subconscious shortcuts rather than carefully weighing all the information we put in front of them.
Our guest in this episode, number 478, is Nancy Harhut, author of Using Behavioral Science in Marketing and Chief Creative Officer of HBT Marketing. Nancy specializes in applying behavioral science to help organizations prompt action and build stronger connections with their audiences.
Nancy explains how behavioral science can help learning businesses better understand what truly drives attention, decision-making, and action, from the role of emotion to the power of specificity and simplicity in messaging.
And in the spirit of keeping things to 3, because as Nancy points out, 3 is a very persuasive number, you'll hear practical takeaways in 3 areas: understanding what drives learner decisions, crafting messages that prompt action, and increasing engagement and follow-through once learners enroll.
So if you want to better understand why prospects sometimes act in confounding ways, how to prompt the actions you want, and how to keep learners engaged after they enroll, then this conversation with Nancy Harhut is for you. Well, so maybe tell us a little bit more about HBT marketing, kind of what it does, and a little bit more about your role there.
Sure. So what we do is a little different than what a lot of marketing agencies do, in that we take marketing best practices, but we overlay behavioral science on top of them. So what do I mean when I say behavioral science? Well, it's very simply the study of how people behave, or more specifically, why do people do what they do, and how can a marketer get them to do more of what we want them to do? So that's what we specialize in. We do email campaigns, direct mail campaigns, landing pages, social campaigns, but the net is we help our clients get more of the response they're looking for by tapping into these decision-making shortcuts that everyone, including our clients, customers, and prospects, rely on.
So right there in the name of it, you have this HBT, human behavior triggers. And I think that gets right to that behavioral science aspect and an angle that you were talking about. So maybe just talk a little bit about what you think people most often misunderstand about humans, how humans make decisions, and what actually influences the actions that we take.
Sure. So I think that the number one misconception about how people make decisions is we think that people make well thought out, well considered decisions. And, there's a reason for that. We think that we make well thought out, well considered decisions. So of course we think our customers and our prospects do as well. But there is a lot of scientific evidence that suggests otherwise. Do we put our thinking caps on? Do we weigh the pros and cons? Sure, sometimes, right? Sometimes we do that cost-benefit analysis, but a lot of times we're cruising through life on autopilot. And what happens is we're cruising along on autopilot and we're relying on these hardwired decision-making shortcuts that humans have developed over the ages as a way to conserve mental energy. And so when we as marketers craft our messages, we devote so much time and energy to making sure that they're perfect and they say exactly what they need to say. And we think that our audience is going to spend, as much time absorbing the message as we do creating it. And the sad reality is that's not what happens. People skim and they scan. Different things attract their attention. A lot of times they just completely overlook things. They're, half paying attention, half onto something else. And they're not making decisions the way we think they are. In fact, very often they're making decisions emotionally, and then they're justifying their decisions with all of those rational reasons that we pack into our marketing messages. So I think that's probably a big misconception or a big mistake that marketers run into, which is we think that people are making these well thought out, well considered decisions, and they're often not.
Well, so I'm thinking we're going to get into a little bit more specifics as we continue to talk. And I know that a lot of our listeners, their learning businesses rely very heavily on email when they're trying to get registrations for courses or get folks to a conference or get them to pursue a certificate or any of their other offerings. And so I would love to hear from you on what you see as some of the common mistakes in email marketing, and then even more importantly, kind of what behavioral science suggests that we should do instead or do differently in our email marketing.
Sure. So I'm gonna build on what I was just saying, which is this emotional, rational thing. One of the big mistakes is we think that people are rational, so we pack our emails with all these rational reasons. What we should be doing is we should be leading with something that's emotional, right? And then we can follow up with the rational reasons. There's research that shows that up to 95% of purchase decision making takes place in the subconscious mind. There's also research that shows that we need to tap into the emotional parts of our brains in order to make a decision. There was a researcher named Antonio Damasio, and he conducted research among humans who had sustained injury to the part of their brain that controls emotion. And what he found was they were virtually incapable of making a decision. Even a decision as simple as, what would you like for lunch today, Celisa? They couldn't decide, right? Back and forth and round and round. They couldn't decide. And Damasio proved that we need to access the emotional parts of our brains. So what we should be doing in email marketing is we should be leading with that emotion and then backing it up with the rational reasons. But now, as I tell you that, I want to quickly add a caveat, which is to say we don't want to put too many reasons in, right? We don't want to jam too much in. One would think that if you're listing all the benefits of taking a course or going to a conference, right? The more the better, right? I mean, that kind of makes sense. The more benefits I will take away, the more likely I am to say, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. And yet that's not true. There was research from UCLA and Georgetown that showed that 3 bulleted benefits, right? 3 bullet points, whether it's in your email or your landing page or even on product packaging. 3 is better than 4 or 5, right? When you have 1 or 2, it's not enough. It doesn't really carry the momentum. 3 is the magic number. In fact, 3 bullet points are judged to be 10.4% more persuasive than 4 bullet points. So again, it's a little counterintuitive. We think, well, the more the better, and let's go with 5 or 6 or 10, and really 3 is what we want. So what we want to do as email marketers is we want to lead with the emotion. We want to be clear and concise, right? So concise, keep it to the 3 bullets. Don't try to say everything. Don't try to be everything to everyone. Have an email campaign if you have a lot to say, if you have a lot to share, but don't try to put it all into one. And then we want to be clear, because a lot of times what we do in email marketing is we talk around what we really want to say. We talk about our solutions, but we don't really define what they are. We talk about outcomes, but we're not specific about what they are. And research has shown that the more specific we can be, the more persuasive we are, right? Concrete language is way better, way more effective than abstract or vague language. There was one study that was done with an e-commerce site, and for a period of 90 days, they instructed their salespeople, their marketing people, to use more concrete language. So, say they were selling pants. Instead of saying pants, they would say blue jeans, right? Just a little bit more specific, a little bit more concrete, right? They won't say the same thing, but one is just one creates that mental picture in a different way than the other does. Blue jeans is a more concrete mental picture than pants, right? So for a period of 90 days, they used the more concrete language. Spend went up 30%. So we want the emotion, we want to be concise, and we want to be clear, concrete. We want to create those mental pictures so that people can see what they will get if they sign up, if they say yes to the offer.
So you said lead with emotion. Can you offer an example or two of like what emotion, how we might go about evoking that emotion in an email?
Sure, sure. So, think about it. You're in a professional setting, right? So people think, oh, well, people are going to make decisions based on the good of the business. And it's all very practical and very rational and very cut and dry. And yet, at the end of the day, we're all people. And what might prompt me to take a class or to sign up for a course? Well, it might be the idea that my boss or the board are going to be very pleased with me. It might be the idea that I'm going to feel really smart and empowered and confident in my job. It could be the idea that if I don't take this course, I'm going to feel like I'm lagging behind, I'm losing out, right? And none of us like to feel that way. In fact, the pain of loss can actually be twice as powerful as the pleasure of gain. So the temptation sometimes is to, say, oh, all these wonderful things that will happen to you, if you just sign up for our course. And there's nothing wrong with benefits. We need benefits. But sometimes a little well-placed loss aversion is going to go further. The things that you'll lose out on if you don't sign up for the course, or the pain you can avoid if you do sign up for the course, right? You won't find yourself lagging behind. You won't find yourself with that blank stare on your face when you're in this next, department meeting and you have no idea what this latest technology is all about, or So it's tapping into some of these very human emotions that you might think, well, for business to consumer, sure, but business to business, not so much. But we really do want to tap into them for business to business. It's how you're going to feel if you don't take the course, how you're going to feel if you do take the course, how you think the boss might feel about you if you take the course. Those are the emotions you want to go after.
Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
I would love to get your thoughts on how AI is changing how people think about attention, about trust, about persuasion. Are there major changes, or is it still sort of the same fundamentals, but now AI is just sort of adding more to the mix?
That's a very good and nuanced question. So things are definitely changing with AI. I mean, they're changing so rapidly. But by the same token, people are people, and we as a species have, humans have developed certain hardwired decision-making shortcuts that have been with us literally over the ages, and they serve their purpose for our ancient ancestors by helping them stay alive. And they're so embedded in us now that we just default to them without thinking. So the behavioral science is still very, very effective. But how is AI kind of entering into the picture and maybe changing things? Well, you mentioned attention, you mentioned trust, you mentioned persuasion. So trust has become really key right now. If you're a brand, you absolutely need to be trusted. And with the advent of AI, trust is beginning to start to erode. And it's really interesting. There have been behavioral science studies that show that if a human gets something wrong, gives you the wrong answer, gives you the wrong information, you can be a little bit more forgiving, right? But when the AI does it, people get angry because we hold artificial intelligence to a higher standard. So we have to be very careful as marketers that the information that we're putting out there is in fact correct, that we're not making mistakes. And yet we know that AI hallucinates, AI, tries to please, AI will grab the most likely answer, but it might not be the correct answer. So we have to worry about those things. We also know, behavioral scientists have studied this, that now, because AI is so prevalent, people aren't searching as deeply. First answer that comes up with that AI box that, kind of summarizes everything, we're like, okay, good, I'm done. I've got my answer. So, what does that mean? It means that we have to really capture somebody's attention. We have to make sure they pay attention to our message. And what comes in handy here is storytelling, because you have a story that only you can tell, right? And AI can't create it for you. It's yours and yours alone. It's not like one of your competitors. It's not like someone else's. So storytelling also has a lot of emotion, for that matter, too. So it helps with that emotional connection, but it also helps you stand out. It helps you capture that attention, helps you build the trust, because you're speaking, honestly and authentically, and you're sharing details that no one else would have. So those are things that help you grab attention. So does something called the von Restorff effect, which behavioral scientists describe as this idea that when you stand out from everything around you, people notice you and they have a greater likelihood to remember you. So AI is kind of the great equalizer. Everyone's going to be doing the same thing. We're all going to sound the same. We're all saying the same things, taking the same approach. So this is when a marketer wants to think about, how can I do things differently, right? If everyone is zigging, let's zag. But what can I do that's going to make me sound different, look different, seem different? Because that's what's going to own the space in my target's mind. And that's what's going to make them think of me versus the competition. So those are just a few of the ways that AI is factoring in there. I mean, we still know that storytelling works. We still know that the von Restorff effect is effective. We still know that people value trust. We just have to deploy those things against this changing background of AI kind of entering the mix.
Yeah, I think especially that idea of AI kind of delivering the same answer to everyone. And so that does kind of almost, there's sort of a certain blandness to AI generated content or ideas. So that idea of going deeper and figuring out how you can zag if others are zigging, that really resonates with me. A lot of our listeners offer certifications, they offer education, they offer all sorts of professional development opportunities. And these are things that the people they serve will say that they value, but they still won't necessarily do them. They'll still postpone them or, not sign up for that course or that conference. So talk a little bit about what behavioral science might help us understand about why adults might delay acting even on things that they say they themselves value and matter to them.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what it comes down to is, very often people will say one thing and do another. And so you're like, why did they lie to me? But they didn't really lie. They believed what they were saying at the time, but then, something else happened. So a couple of things happened. One is this idea of present focus bias. So behavioral scientists have found that humans love instant gratification. We want what we want and we want it now. And if the payoff is a little bit further down the road, if it's more distant, we have a tendency to devalue it. So, imagine you've got $100 in your hands. You'd probably like to go out to dinner and a show versus save that money for a rainy day, right? Put it in your retirement account, right? So it's the same thing with education. It's like, yeah, I think this is a great idea. We should have professional development. We should have these courses. We should have these webinars or seminars or conferences. Yes, and I want to go, but not today, right? I'm going to do it later because the payoff is later, right? Like I have to go, I have to learn this, and eventually it's going to help me in my career. And because it's a more distant payoff, we're less likely to act on it right away. We want the immediate gratification, right? Another thing that behavioral scientists talk about is something called the intention action gap. And there again, it's like, yes, I intend to take this. Yes, I want to. Yes, I think this is a great idea, but we just don't quite get around to doing it. We think we're going to. We assume that we will. It makes sense at the time, and yet other things come up, things distract us, things get in the way. So I think that the important takeaway here is it's not that people are lying when they say they value this, that they say that it's important. They're not lying. They're not really good at predicting their future behavior. There's some behavioral science studies that show a complete stranger can better predict what you'll do in the future than you yourself can. So it's tough. That's what we're working against. So what marketers need to do is we need to kind of overcome that idea of present focus bias, right? We need to build a bridge between who you are right now saying, yeah, I work in this field and I like this field and I want to continue to succeed in this field. And so I want to keep learning and growing, right? That person and the person who is actually going to benefit from it. It's like you're saying this right now. And if you really believe that, you want to do well in this field and staying in this field requires continuing education, then you need to take this step so that, 1 month, 1 year, 2 years down the road, you'll have what you need. And there are ways to kind of create that bridge. One is by getting you to think of yourself today, but in the future. So using words like imagine, imagine having this new certification, imagine having taken this class and learning, these 3 points, right? Because if you ask someone to imagine something, they can create that mental picture. And if they can create the mental picture, they're much more likely to act on it. Because when you think about it, when people make a decision, it happens twice. It happens once in their brains, once in their heads, right? They decide to do it, and then they actually physically do it. So if you can, build that bridge by saying, imagine yourself, or can you see yourself, or picture yourself, that can be very, very helpful. And then the other thing we can do, again, saying, understanding that people prefer instant gratification, we can pull some little element out where we do get instant gratification. Now, if we're asking someone to sign up for a course and the course is going to take 10 weeks, or we're asking them to sign up for a conference and the conference isn't for 3 months, that's not instant gratification. But maybe you can sign up in a minute. Now that's instant gratification, right? Or maybe, sign up and we'll immediately send you the cheat sheet or the curriculum, or but anything that we can pull forward that has, that instant gratification, even if it's just a small element of the larger course, conference, what have you, that can work in our favor in terms of overcoming present focus bias.
So let's say we've overcome that present focus bias. We've gotten someone to sign up for that course or to register for that conference. Do some of the same behavioral principles still apply once we get folks, at the conference or in the classroom? Because I'm thinking about things that can sometimes be hurdles even after you get their registration, things like having them actually make sure that they show up for all the sessions, that they complete the work, that they actually are engaging in the discussions or whatever coursework. So talk a little bit about how or whether we might be able to leverage some of those behavioral science techniques even after the sale, sort of beyond the initial marketing.
Sure. So one thing that comes to mind right away is something called social proof. And it's the idea that when we're uncertain, we have a tendency to do what other people do, particularly if those people are like us. And you can actually use this both for acquisition and for once we have, somebody enrolled. So for acquisition, it would be like, a lot of people in this industry or, have signed up for this, or we're 90% full, right? So it's like, oh, people like me are signing up for this course or for this conference. Maybe I should too. But then once somebody's enrolled, we can continue to use social proof. We can talk about the fact that most people complete their assignments in the first week, or 79% of people participate at least once in a discussion group, or, so we start to, use that idea of social proof because, people don't really always know what to do. And so we look to others and we assume that if they're doing it, it must be the thing to do. And if all of these people are participating, I should participate. If all of these people are actually turning their assignments in on time, I should too. If all of these people signed up for the advanced version of the course, maybe I should too. Then there's something known as commitment and consistency. And it's this idea that once someone takes the first step, makes that first commitment, they're much more likely to remain consistent with it when future opportunities arise. So if we get that first yes, and somehow make it public, that's even better, we're much more likely to get that second, that third, that fourth yes, and we can continue to increase our asks. So maybe what we do is we get someone to say, yeah, I'm interested in this course. Send me a little bit more information. So they haven't even committed to taking it yet. They're just saying, yeah, I'm interested. That's a really small ask. And if they're answering somehow in public, so much the better. Like maybe they're doing it on LinkedIn, for example, right? Or maybe in a physical setting, with a show of hands, or But it doesn't always have to be public. But the key is that first small yes. So yeah, I'm interested. Then you send the information, and the person is much more likely to look at the information because they requested it. So you don't have to think about it again. It's like, oh yeah, right. I already vetted that course or that organization, or that conference. So it's much more likely that they're just going to keep moving along. So it's like, all right, they take a look at it, and then it's like, well, I asked for the information. I guess I should sign up. Why would I have asked for it if I didn't think I wanted to sign up, And so you start to do that. Now you're in the class and it's the same thing. It's like, well, you've made this investment of time and money to take this class. So make sure you stay current with it. Make sure you get the most out of it that you can. So there are ways to just kind of tap into that idea of commitment and consistency. You made that first commitment, just keep doing it. Labeling is another great tactic. And what behavioral scientists have found is when you label somebody as part of a group, they start to behave like the other members in that group, even if they hadn't previously considered themselves to be a member of that group. So it was interesting, researchers in Chicago interviewed people about an upcoming election. And, after talking to them for a while, they put them into one group or another. And they did it completely arbitrarily. It had nothing to do with the interview questions. They just kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mo, But they went to one group and they said, you guys are the more politically active. And on election day, 15% more of those people showed up to vote, simply because they were told they were more politically active. What would a politically active person do on election day? They would show up to vote, right? So if you start to address some people and say, you're among our best students, you're someone who's committed to furthering your career, you're someone who's serious about education, you start to label people that way, they start to behave that way, even if they didn't think, I've never really thought of myself as being particularly serious about education, but when you say, hey, you're one of our better learners, or you're someone who's serious about, getting the most out of this class, you start to kind of rise to the occasion and you start to behave like the other members in that group of people who are serious about education, that group of people who are, among the most active students. So those are a couple of ways that I think we can use behavioral science tactics, not just to get somebody interested initially and enrolled initially, but to get them to follow through and to be an active participant on the journey.
That labeling example is very interesting to me because I'm thinking about mindset and how we know that that's very important in adult learning, and that idea of, do you have the growth mindset or a more fixed mindset, and how you can encourage people to adopt the growth mindset by saying things like, you are a, committed learner, or, you have the ability to learn this if you apply yourself. So I really appreciate that. We also know that there are things that are very effective in learning, like reflection and practice, making sure that people don't just listen to an idea, but actually put it to work, and that they begin to apply it. So I guess any additional thoughts about kind of how behavioral science can help us better encourage those activities that we know are so important to adult learning, but that really rely on that adult learner to, they have to take the time to elaborate, to practice, to reflect. So what would you say to help us with that aspect?
Sure. So, I do a lot of speaking and training. And one of the things that I've learned through behavioral science, which I apply in my own work, is you try to do maybe 20 minutes of content and then take some kind of a break. And it doesn't have to be a stand up and stretch break. It doesn't have to be a stop, go get a coffee break, but some kind of just a switch. If I've been talking for 15 minutes, let's pause and do an assignment, for example. And actually doing an assignment, and you alluded to this, is a great way to help encode the information in someone's brain, because when you're a passive listener, you're absorbing some of it. If you have a tendency to write, you're absorbing even more of it, and writing by hand is better than tapping on the keyboard. There's scientific studies that show that to be true. But if you then are asked, okay, how would you apply this at your law firm, at your accounting firm, at your, place of business, whatever, that forces people to actively use the information that they've just heard or that they've just taken notes on. And that makes it more likely to stick in their memories, more likely to be able to be called up when they actually need it. So that's something that I practice. That's something that I think, it would be worthwhile. The other couple of interesting things that come to mind are behavioral scientists have found that words that sound alike or that begin with the same sound are encoded in the same part of the brain, and they're easier to retrieve, and that makes them more memorable and actually more credible, more believable. So whenever we can use alliteration, a series of words that begin with the same sound or the same letter, or whenever we can use rhyme, it's not just a fun little, marketing trick or linguistic trick. It's actually a tool to help people better remember information. Now, obviously, as we're teaching, as we're developing course material, everything can't rhyme or, be alliterative, but when you have like a key framework or key points that you really want people to remember, it's helpful to tap into alliteration. It's helpful to tap into rhyme because it just makes it more likely that people are going to encode that information. They're going to remember it. They're going to be able to retrieve it easily. And the interesting thing is when the brain can more easily retrieve information, it feels right. And when something feels right, it's not a big leap for us to assume that it is right. So it makes the information more truthful, more accurate, more credible. And obviously, if something is truthful, if it's accurate, we have a tendency to believe it. If we don't think that something is credible or accurate, we're not going to believe it and we're not going to retain it. We're not going to use it. So there are some, definite advantages in addition to memory for using things like alliteration, for using things like rhyme. And again, it can't be for everything, but for certain key points that you want to deliver, certain frameworks, certain, approaches, can be very, very helpful.
If we have listeners who are thinking, okay, wow, this all makes so much sense, but how do I begin to apply this? So, are there some practical or kind of low risk, not too heavy on the investment front ways that a learning business could start applying some of this behavioral science that you've been citing and mentioning as we talk?
Sure. So, I come from a test and learn background. And so, you mentioned that a lot of your listeners rely on email to get people to enroll. So, carve out a little pilot program and have your regular emails that you usually send, but then do a version that uses, social proof that, we're going to tap into the fact that a lot of people are doing this, or loss aversion, here's what you're going to miss out on if you don't sign up, or, one of these behavioral science tactics, and do a test and see, all right, it's not going to take you that much time or effort to just develop a second version of the email, right? A lot of the content could be the same, but how you get into it, maybe you take your existing one and you really, you infuse emotion into the beginning of it, and you test the existing against the emotionally infused one. And then you just look to see, well, what does the engagement look like? Are we getting more clicks, more inquiries, more signups? And it's a pretty simple way to begin to work your way into adopting some of these behavioral science tactics, right? It doesn't require throwing out everything you're currently doing. It doesn't require a new, addition to your MarTech stack, nothing like that. It's just creating a version of your marketing message that embraces behavioral science, and then taking a look and seeing, all right, am I getting the traction that I hope I will, that I expect that I should from these tactics? And if the first one doesn't work, try a second one, because not everything works for everyone. What we're talking about are tactics that generally are very effective, but what you want to do is you want to test your way in and find out what's the best way to reach your target with your target's mindset and with your message. And you do a little bit of experimentation, and you begin to start to build that foundation for what's going to work for your marketing messages and your situation.
So as you were talking about that, idea of testing some different options, you were talking about clicks and opens and conversion even. And we always talk about learning businesses really needing to focus on three key areas: reach, revenue, and impact. And so, getting folks to enroll in that course, that's very clearly tied to the revenue part of it. That's going to help the learning business achieve those revenue targets. But another big part of what they're after is that impact, and making sure that once they get people to that course or that conference, those people actually are learning, and it is actually helping them improve what they're doing on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, whatever it is. So if a learning business is really trying to think about measuring how behavioral science can maybe help them achieve their goals, is there a way to sort of look at any kind of metrics, measures that might be kind of beyond those clicks and enrollment rates and things like that?
Sure. I think, based on what you said, what comes to mind is looking at, customer satisfaction scores, referrals, recommendations. Are people talking about it on social? Are they sharing about it? Are they, would they recommend the class or the conference next time around? Would they suggest that a colleague attend? How would they rank it? So those are all softer measures, but very important measures. And there's an interesting behavioral science tactic that maybe comes into play. And that is, after the class is over, and this was something that I learned from Dan Ariely, who's a world-renowned behavioral economist, but he also is a professor. He taught at Duke, for example. But he would teach a class, and then afterwards, as the class was concluding, students were supposed to do evaluations. And in order to get a better evaluation, he would say to them, put together a list of 10 things that I can improve next semester. Not one thing, not 3 things, 10 things. And what happens is, you come out of the gate and you're fired up. You're like, oh, you should tell more jokes. You should give us more time for our assignments. Whatever. Right? But after you get through the first 2 or 3, you start to kind of run out of steam, right? 10 is a lot. 10 ways to improve the course, right? And so what happens is you start to think, must have been a pretty good course. I can't think of 10 ways for him to improve. And as a result, you score the class better. You rate it higher. You rate it better. And I thought that was just brilliant. And it makes sense. He said you can do the same thing with your spouse. 3 things to change about my spouse. Boom, boom, boom. I can, rattle that off. 10 things to change about my spouse. I guess I'm pretty happily married. I wouldn't really change much. So it's an interesting tactic. But just getting people to reflect on what they've learned, what they've gained from the class. I know sometimes when I speak at the very end of a training session or at a presentation, I'll go around the room and I'll ask people, what's the one thing you want to try tomorrow, right? So I'm not asking them for 10, but I'm asking the whole room. And everyone's got one thing that they want to try tomorrow. And when you listen to a room of 10 or 20 or 100 or you can't really I've had way bigger rooms than that, but you can't ask 1,000 people, but when you're starting to go around the room and everyone's got something that they're excited about, it's making them reflect on what they just learned and the value of it. So there are definitely ways that understanding human behavior can help when it comes to some of these softer but very important metrics of how people reacted to the class and the course or the conference, and did it have the impact that you were looking for.
You are obviously very well versed in a lot of the research and these concepts. So I want to ask you a question, which we ask of everyone who comes on the Leading Learning podcast, which just is about your own personal continuing learning. How do you approach that? Do you have habits, practices, sources that you use to continue to grow professionally and personally?
Yeah, I do. I love what I do. And so whenever there's a new book out in the category, I'm interested in it. I'm listening to people more than I'm talking on podcast. I go to conferences. I go to conferences to present, but I stick around and I go to all these other sessions and soak up all the information that's available to me. And I also do, I do training sessions. I work with people, and it's a cliche, but I learn as much as I teach, because I know what I know, but different ways to apply it, different ways people are thinking about it, different challenges that people are wrestling with. All of that starts to come back to me, and it makes me a more informed practitioner. So just keeping a finger on the pulse of the industry, reading the podcast, the conferences, just sharing information is a two-way street. Sharing it and taking information back is a complement to that.
We've covered a fair amount of ground in our time together. So if you were to point listeners to, 1 to 3 points that you hope they walk away from this conversation with, what would you say? What would those points be?
Sure. So I think 3 points. Point number 1 would be people don't think the way you think they think, right? So people don't always make these well thought out, well considered decisions. Point number 2, very often they operate on autopilot. They're cruising through life on autopilot. They see a situation and they just default to these hardwired, automatic, instinctive, reflexive responses that have been kind of developed over the ages and are kind of embedded in us. And then the third and very important thing is that these automatic responses can be prompted or triggered. If you have a good grasp of behavioral science, if you understand how people make decisions, you can nudge them or prompt them to make the decisions you want them to make. No magic wand. You can't make people do exactly what you want them to do all of the time, but you increase the likelihood that people will pay attention to your message, that they'll understand it, that they'll remember it, and that they'll act on it if you tap into behavioral science.
That wraps up our conversation with Nancy Harhut, author of Using Behavioral Science in Marketing and Chief Creative Officer at HBT Marketing. Stay with us a moment longer for our recap.
You'll find show notes and a transcript for this episode at leadinglearning.com/episode 478, along with links to the HBT marketing website, Nancy's book, and Nancy's LinkedIn profile. And Nancy invites you to connect on LinkedIn, where she regularly posts and shares about topics we discussed in our conversation, and she welcomes any follow-up questions you might have.
If you found this episode valuable, we'd be grateful if you'd share it. That helps more people find the show and benefit from the conversation, and it supports the work we do.
In our conversation, Nancy highlighted the importance of leading with emotion, being clear and specific in messaging, and keeping things concise. Remember, 3 well-chosen points can often be more persuasive than a longer list.
Plenty to think about and put into action as you seek to attract, engage, and support learners.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.